Morning. Today is the 10th of Shvat, as we mentioned in Shul, Yud Shvat, the 10th of Shvat, which is a significant day in the history of Chabad. And in truth, as I said last night with Mincha Mardev, it's really a significant day in Jewish history. And it wouldn't be far stretched to say in world history. Why is that? Because the 10th of Shvat in the year 1950, which was on Shabbos that year, was the day that the previous Rebbe of Chabad passed away. And 1 year later, in 1951, I think it was a Wednesday like it is today, at the gathering, the Farbrengen, commemorating the first yahrzeit, the first anniversary of the passing of the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe, our Rebbe, assumed leadership of Chabad. And why is that not just a question of Chabad history, but of Jewish history and even world history? Well, because at that gathering, when the Rebbe assumed the leadership of Chabad, and he did so by delivering a formal Hasidic discourse. Anyone can share Torah, anyone can share words of Torah, thoughts of Torah, but to share a Hasidic discourse is uniquely a Rebbe's position. There's a certain tone in which it's delivered, there's a certain methodology to how it's delivered, there's a certain mysticism around the delivery of a Hasidic discourse, and only a Rebbe does that. So when the Rebbe delivered a Hasidic discourse, that was the official statement on taking on the leadership. Now, in that discourse, and in that Farbrengen, that gathering in general, when the Rebbe formally assumed the leadership of Chabad, he declared the mission statement and laid out the vision and the roadmap for his leadership, which we're still the beneficiaries of today. Namely, he declared we're going to reach every single Jew all over the globe and reveal God's presence in this world. Now, in 1951, a couple of years after the war, the Rebbe had a group of followers that I don't think were a total 500 in number, probably less. The amount of followers, committed followers the Rebbe had that were Chabad Hasidim, that counted themselves card-carrying members of Lubavitch. The room in which the Rebbe made this declaration, in which the Rebbe held this gathering, was maybe twice the size of this room. It was packed, but many people that were there were not Chabad Hasidim. Many of them were just curious other people who came to see who's this new young Rebbe that's taking over Lubavitch. But they've made that statement, said we're going to reach out to every single Jew all over the globe and reveal God's presence on earth and bring Mashiach. So at the time, it might have seemed like a high pie in the sky wishful thinking. But 72 years later, no, he meant it. And he did it. Raised an army of people who are dedicated to this mission and are all over the globe. Today, Rebbe has representatives in, if I know the numbers correctly, 102 countries. And I think the total countries is 190. And how many of them are Arab and African countries that don't have any Jews at all? So 102 countries is pretty much the entire globe. Certainly the entire globe in which there are Jews present. The Rebbe's soldiers are there, reaching out to Jews and bringing God's presence. So it's revolutionary and significant, not just in Chabad history, because there's a new Rebbe in Chabad, but because Chabad became a global enterprise. So it's significant in Jewish history, because never in the history of Judaism has there been a movement like this, in which there are representatives literally all over the globe. Never existed before, to reach out to every Jew, never existed before. And I don't think it existed in world history either. So it's a very significant day in world history, this day. Now, what I want to share with you is one more introduction to get to what I want to share with you. That is, the previous Rebbe, toward the end of his life, I mentioned this on Shabbos afternoon at Mincha Mardev. Toward the end of the previous Rebbe's life, it was very difficult for him to speak. So he wouldn't deliver Hasidic discourses as the Rebbe's would, as I described earlier. But what he would do is he would take transcripts of talks he had delivered, of discourses he had delivered in years previous, re-edit them, rewrite them, and publish them for whatever occasion. So in advance of Shabbos, the previous Rebbe's office, who was publishing house, Kahas, who was actually operated by his son-in-law, who later became the Rebbe, they would publish a booklet, which was a new discourse from the Rebbe, even though it wasn't a new one. It was, a rework of an earlier discourse, but it was like the new publication that the Rebbe was delivering. So it wasn't delivering Hasidus discourses verbally early, but in writing. So in advance of Shabbos, the 10th of Shvat, 1915, the previous Rebbe had published, or had slated to publish, a discourse that was 20 chapters long, that he had scheduled to be published, one section for the 10th of Shvat, commemorating his grandmother's passing. Another section of the Maimor was slated to be published on the 13th of Shvat, which was the yahrzeit of his mother, maybe, I think. And then another section was slated to be published on Purim. And the fourth section, the final section, was slated to be published on the 2nd of Iyar, which was his father's yahrzeit. So before he had passed, he had already scheduled to publish this 20-chapter discourse. And it turns out he passed on the day which the first segment of that discourse was published. So even though he had scheduled for it to be published on his grandmother's yahrzeit, it ended up being scheduled to be published on the day of his own passing. Yeah. So this 20-chapter discourse became, for the Rebbe, his father-in-law's, his Rebbe's, the previous Rebbe's, like last will and testament, and charted the course for the next generation. So this vision that I just described earlier, about reaching out to every Jew and transforming the world and making it a place of godliness, that vision is derived from the 20-chapter discourse. And now what the Rebbe would do is, every year on Yud Shvat, on the anniversary of him becoming Rebbe and his father-in-law's passing, every year the Rebbe himself would deliver a Hasidic discourse, and that Hasidic discourse would be based on and expounding another chapter of that 20-chapter discourse. So in 1951, the first discourse that was delivered, the one I described earlier, where he declared that he's going to be reaching out to every Jew and transforming the world to a place of goodness and holiness, that discourse is founded and based on chapter 1 of his father-in-law's discourse. 1952, he delivered a discourse founded and based on and expounding on chapter 2. 53 on third chapter, and so on and so forth. And Rebbe was doing this for almost 40 years, which means that twice Rebbe had gone through the entire 20-chapter discourse, explaining each chapter in depth. And ever since, us Hasidim follow the same practice. And every year, as we gear up for Yud Shvat, for today's day, so Hasidim all over the world are studying chapter 13. This year will be chapter 13, because now it's 5783. So if you do the math of 20 plus 20, and again 20, we're on the fourth cycle, chapter 13. Right? So Hasidim all over the world are learning chapter 13 of the previous Rebbe's discourse, and then they're learning the two discourses that were delivered, one in 1963 and one in 1983, expounding on that one chapter, chapter 13. Yeah, this is background. So what I want to share with you is an idea from that discourse in 1963. So this is a discourse that was delivered on Yud Shvat, on the 10th of Shvat today, 1963, which was the 13th yahrzeit of his father-in-law. So it's 13 years since he assumed the leadership as Rebbe, and he's delivering a talk explaining chapter 13 of his father-in-law's discourse. Which is a chapter for this year. Right, so 1963, 1983, 2003, 2023.
Were the messages the same?
So the overarching message in that we have to transform the world and make it into a place that's holy and godly, and transform our own selves to become holy and godly, that message is overarching, universally the same, because that's the message of that 20-chapter discourse. But the details of that are different every year. New nuance, new ideas, new levels, new angles, and so on. So here is a message from this year's chapter, and then the discourse, 1963, Tavshin Chav Gimel, in which Rebbe expounds it. at least one of the ideas. So what's the previous Rebbe saying in chapter 13? The previous Rebbe is explaining a statement from the Zohar, statement in the Zohar. And the reason why he's explaining the statement is because the statement that he's about to explain from the Zohar is a statement that describes the infinite nature of God. And the previous Rebbe is explaining that the infinite nature of God is a kind of treasure. It's God's treasure, his infinite energy. And that treasure is being gifted to the foot soldiers who are transforming this world into a home for Hashem. As is the case with a human king, when the human king's sovereignty is being threatened, then all the treasures that he has, which ordinarily are behind lock and key and guard, the king will take those treasures and expend whatever is necessary to win the battle because his very sovereignty is on the line. So God's kingdom, God's vision for making this home into a world for Hashem, says God's kingdom, if that's being threatened because there's opposition that says no godliness, then all the treasures of Hashem are being splurged on the foot soldiers, that is you and I, who are transforming this world. That's the point the previous Rebbe is trying to make, that the amount of infinite energy Hashem is investing in us so we can achieve our mission of transforming ourselves in the world. This is the point the previous Rebbe is trying to make in his discourse. So as I mentioned, to do that, he's explaining the statement of the Zohar that describes God's infinite nature, because it's God's infinite nature that's being invested in us to achieve the mission. So what does the Zohar say about God's infinite nature? The Zohar says as follows: Oir Ein Sof, the light with no end, or the infinite light, is Lamayla Mailad and Ketz, extends above to no end, Lamata Mata den Tachlis, and descends below to no consumption, meaning to no conclusion. So the infinite light extends above to no end and descends below to no conclusion. So one could learn the Zohar, one could learn that statement to mean simply, it's really one statement. It's describing infinite. Infinite extends above to no end and below to no end. That's what infinite is. Highest levels, lowest levels, it's infinite. Yeah. But Chassidus, in a number of places, specifically in this discourse of the previous Rebbe, explains that actually the Zohar is saying three different things. Why? Well, if you say infinite, then you don't need to say anything else. If it's infinite, then of course it extends to above and below. In fact, once you say it extends above and below, now you're giving it limits and terms. It expands this way, it expands that way. No. It's infinite. Infinite completely disregards above and below. That's the whole point of infinite. It transcends. So not only does it seem like a redundant statement, the infinite extends above and below. Of course, infinite is everywhere. But actually, it seems to actually reduce the nature of the infinite. Because first you said it's infinite, which is no end, no description. And then you're giving it a description. It extends here and extends there. So what does the Zohar mean? So explains the previous Rebbe like this. There's three different statements in the Zohar. Statement number one is the divine is infinite. The divine is beyond definition. Then comes the Zohar and says, you should know that this fact about God, that God is beyond definition, is not in disregard of our reality. But that very fact of God that is beyond description is itself embedded in the highest levels and itself embedded in the lowest levels. So when the Zohar says that God extends above to no end, and specifically the second statement, which is the subject of chapter 13, that the infinite descends below, it doesn't mean simply that God expresses himself infinitely, but his infinite nature is beyond that thing down there. He creates infinitely. Or he extends below to no end, but whatever is there makes a difference because infinite doesn't care at all for definitions. It's beyond. But actually what the Zohar is trying to tell you is that within what you perceive as a lowly state of reality, in there is the very infinite of God. Now that is something that's much more of an incredible statement. That God is not just infinite, and God is not just beyond anything that can possibly be described, But actually, in the very descriptions, in the very state of lowliness, in there is all of God's infiniteness.
It's almost like trying to squeeze it in a box.
That's correct. And that's why it's so
That's
incredible.
why we don't
That's why it's such a mind-boggling statement from the Zohar, and why it's such an infinite. But you're squeezing infinite into a box, right? Which means to say what the Zohar is telling you is God's beyond infinite. Because infinite is limited to not being finite.
have a coexistence.
But the true infinite of God is such that even in the finite, he's there. And the Mimer goes on to describe in different ways, actually in chapter 12 first, explain how you can see even within the nature of the world infinite creation, the fact that we have infinite capacity for reproduction, even though we're limited beings. So how could I produce more than what I have? And yet I can have many children. And in fact, from my progeny, there could be children to infinity. All kinds of different ways in which that even in the limited nature of reality, we could see the infinite. In this chapter 13, especially as the Rebbe explains it, it makes the point very strongly that even in the space of the lowly reality, it's not just that the infinite has its imprint on it, but that the infinite is expressed there, but that the infinite itself is embedded in it. That's the mata din tachlis. That God is below, down below, to no consumption, that even in the space that seems to be down below, he is there in his full infinite self. And the Mimer goes on to say that there are stages of this descent. First and foremost, there's the fact that God himself chooses to have finite description. This would be what we call the world of Atzilus, or the worlds of beyond Atzilus, which is God choosing to express himself in finite description. God's kind, God's wise, God's understanding, God's strong. The 10 spheres, the 10 attributes. These are finite modalities in which Hashem's infinite nature is embedded. But that is not so mind-blowing that the infinite is there. Because in Atzilus, as we learn in Chassidus, Atzilus is completely one with God. There is no sense of otherness. So the fact that Hashem's infinite is expressed in a space that does not see itself as a separate entity and an other, okay, that's nice, but not so amazing. Following? Then we go even lower. We go to the worlds that's called in Kabbalah, Beriya, Yetzira, and Asiya. In their abbreviation, they're called Biyah. Biyah is Beis, Yud, Ayin, which stands for Beriya, Yetzira, and Asiya. They are 3 worlds, the lowest of which Asiya is our world, our physical world, but they're worlds in which a sense of otherness exists. In the world of Beriya, they say, I appreciate and understand God. In the world of Yetzirah, they say, I love God, I fear God. And in this world, we say, I see what God did, if we have our eyes open. But in all of those statements, the first word is I, because there's a sense of otherness. In Atzilus, there is no statement I. In Atzilus is, this is God's wisdom. This is God's kindness. There's no I. It's a world of oneness. So it's not so mind-blowing that the infinite is embedded there. But then you come to a world of otherness in which there are entities that say I exist, even if they say I appreciate God. But if they say I exist, that means there's a sense of otherness and separation from Hashem. And to say that even in there, the infinite truth of Hashem is there, and that's mind-blowing. Following? Then he descends even lower. Not only into these worlds of otherness, but even into the physical world. And not just into the physical world, but even into a space that denies God. Not denies God because they don't know God is there. They know God is there. And still deny. What's the model for that? The model for that is Paroi. Paroi, his blessing comes from Yaakov. Yaakov, God's agent in this world, blesses Paroi, and as a result, the Nile rises to greet him as he approaches, and Egypt flourishes. Paroi knows that. Paroi knows that his blessing in life comes from Yaakov. comes from God's agent. So it's not as if God is concealed from him. God is revealed from him. The infinite nature of God's right there. Just a beautiful blessing from Yaakov. And as the Rebbe explains it, the blessing from Yaakov is not simply that Egypt was successful physically, but spiritually too. Because then Yaakov's there, and they're providing the land of Goshen for the Jews to live in. The Jews are serving God. And if the Jews are serving God, and the Egyptians are providing the means for the Jews to serve God, then the Egyptians take part in that too. So not only is Pharaoh knowingly enjoying the blessings of Hashem from Yaakov, but he's enjoying a spiritual fulfillment thanks to Yaakov. And yet Paro declares famously from the prophet says this, it's in the Haftarah. We read it in the Haftarah on Parshas Boy, right? I think it's a Boy, where Paro says, the Nile is mine, I made it, and I made myself. Does he not know that God's presence is there? He knows God's presence is there, but still says, it's me. And this is the extent to which the infinite nature of Hashem descends, that even into the lowest place of reality, even into a place like Pharaoh, where they know God's blessing and deny it, even there God's presence is. Because the nature of, as Isaiah puts it, Lamata Mata Tintachlis, God's infinite nature descends to be invested even in the lowest space, even in a space that knowingly denies him. What's the parallel for this Pharaoh in our relationship with Hashem? Because we can also be like that sometimes. So the previous Rebbe gives two models for this. One from physical blessing and one spiritual blessing. A Jew can be in business and successful. And ask him, how are you doing in business? He says, thank God. So he knows his blessings come from God. Like Pharaoh knew his blessings came from God. But then, when he gets very successful, he feels a little more arrogant about himself. Why are you feeling arrogant about yourself? You did it. Don't you agree that it comes from Hashem? Yeah, it comes from Hashem, but I was a clever businessman. I did a good deal. So it's like Pharaoh. I know this is God's blessing, and still I make it mine. And the same thing true of a Jew learning Torah. A Jew can learn Torah. And you ask him, whose Torah is this? Why you're learning? What do you mean? It's Hashem's Torah. He starts every day, makes a bracha on Torah. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God of the world. Hanoisin HaTorah, who gives us the Torah. In the present tense, Hashem is giving me Torah, so he acknowledges that this is God's Torah. And yet, the more he learns, the more arrogant he becomes. I'm smart. I'm a scholar. And thanks to that arrogance, he can end up using the logic of Torah to come to a conclusion that's opposite to Torah. That's about him. Even though he acknowledges this is Hashem's Torah. This is like a Pharaoh type thing, where he knows that this is from Hashem's blessing. He knows Hashem is granting him both physical life and spiritual life, and yet he's still arrogant about his own version of life, about himself. Even in that space, where there's a Jew who knows Hashem's blessing, knows it's the infinite, and denies it, there too the infinite is embedded. Because lamata mata tintachlis, the infinite nature of God descends even to the lowest place, even to the place that knows him and denies him. Even to the space of a Jew who knowingly misappropriates God's blessing. What's the point of this? There's two things. Number one, a Jew should know there's no such thing as giving up hope. Because no matter how low a Jew descends, Hashem's infinite nature is there with him. So there's no such thing as, I can't. It's over, I'm done, I'm a lost hope. No such thing. Even in Pharaoh, even a state of thinking like Pharaoh, the infinite nature of Hashem is there too. And therefore, Bal Yidach Men Nidach, no one's beyond repair, no one's beyond hope. That's number one. Number two, as I heard a friend of mine put it, I think he put it very nicely. He says, Hashem wants us to know how much we mean to him. Like a parent-child relationship. So there's lots of dynamics to the relationship. Okay, there's the father's a teacher, he's explaining things to the kid. There's the father as a provider, at the home, food, whatever else, whatever the role the father provides in the family. He's the fun master, take them on trips. I don't know, whatever his job is. Yeah. From that definition, if that's the definition of the relationship, teacher and student, mentor, guide, provider and recipient, then when the child misbehaves or doesn't listen to what he's told, throws the food that his father provided him on the floor, or takes the lessons his father gave him and uses it for some negative. So if the relationship is defined simply by the give and take of father to child, then you broke the pact. It's over. Done. Gone. You ruined the relationship. But obviously, you ask any father, relationship is done because of that. What is that supposed to mean? It's my son. So all the other things that the father provides, that doesn't define the relationship. It's a symptom of the relationship. It's an outburst of the relationship. The relationship is father-child. And because of father-child, therefore I guide, therefore I provide. But inherently, at the core, it's father-child, period. And what? When the kid misbehaves, now the father-child is in a relationship. Even if the father's upset and the father's going to punish. What? So the father-child relationship stopped because father has to implement discipline. It's still my child. Still love him deeply. We still have an essential attachment and bond. Even when from the child's perspective, he feels like he's stepping out of what he's supposed to as a child, and it's true, he is stepping out of the bounds, and he has to correct his behavior. But from the father's perspective, this is my child. It doesn't make a difference. And this is what Hashem is telling us in Lamata Mata Tachlis. Hashem's infinite nature descends even to the lowest place, even to the Yid who's messing up, even to the Yid who's misappropriating Hashem's blessing knowingly. Hashem says, "You're still my child. You're still my child. I mean, there's some part of me that doesn't care about you. I only care about you under this framework, but not this framework. Hashem cares everything, always, even when we screw up." That's the Lamata Mata Tachlis. This is the idea that Hashem descends to the lowest place, even when we are willingly messing up the whole thing. Hashem says, I'm still there. My entirety, my whole infinite me is still invested in you. And if no such thing as lost hope. And the minute you want, I'm here to re-embrace you. All you have to do is to acknowledge that it's my Torah. Acknowledge it's my blessings given to you. Acknowledge that I'm here. That's it. Just acknowledge Hashem's presence. And that's how you reveal him. So this is the hope and the avodah of Lamata Mata Tachlis. The hope, the encouragement that Hashem is invested even to the lowest place, even when we mess up. The encouragement, there's no such thing as lost hope. And likewise, this is also the mandate of this idea. To don't let it be a place which is void of Hashem. Acknowledge Hashem. Embrace him, because he's already there. He's just waiting for you to embrace him. Because from his perspective, he's there already. So this is one very powerful message to me, it seems to be the central message of this year's Maimer, this year's discourse that Rebbe delivered in 1963, expounding on chapter 13 of his Falmud's discourse, which is published in anticipation or slated, and that was published on the day that he finally passed away. And just to conclude, this is, as I said, this whole discourse is like the previous of his discourse. Rebbe saw that as like the mission statement and the mandate for this generation. And this message is very much important for our generation. In the 21st century, especially as we get younger and younger, if we go down to younger generations, the old model of unless you perform, you're nothing, you better perform, otherwise you're going to be an outcast, that model doesn't work anymore. Kids hear that and I'm a reject because I don't behave. Goodbye, I'm a reject. Leave me alone. The way we interact with, especially today's youth, is with this message. It doesn't make a difference what you do. You're still valuable. You're still Hashem's child. Hashem is still waiting for you. All you need to do is just embrace it. So you tell a child that he's valuable no matter what, now he's willing to stand up to the plate. That's the message of empowerment of our generation. To use another element of that discourse, taking the arrogance of our generation that says, I'm the center of the universe, to say, yes, you are the center of the universe because Hashem infinitely cares about you. So the arrogance that says, I'm the center of the world, the whole world owes me, the entitlement generation. You tell a child, yes, of course you're the center of the world because Hashem is waiting for you in all of his infiniteness. So yes, you are the center of the universe because the whole universe, and Hashem included, is waiting for you to embrace it. Very powerful and uplifting and transformative message. So we should all be so lucky to be able to internalize this message and impart it to others and indeed transform the whole world. Have a wonderful day, Eden.
Now,